Mother receives a phone call at 3 a.m. Her son is dead. Prison officials tell her it was suicide. But when she sees his body at the funeral home, she counts 17 different wounds. Broken ribs. A fractured skull. Injuries that no suicide could explain. She demands answers. She demands the security footage. She is told the cameras in that cell block were not functioning that night. They had been broken for months. Nobody thought to fix them. Nobody thought her son mattered enough to protect. If stories like this shake you to your core, hit that like button right now, drop a comment, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe because this channel exposes what the system desperately wants to keep hidden behind concrete walls and razor wire. This is the reality inside America's worst prisons. Places where inmates check in but never check out. Where official reports contradict physical evidence. Where families spend years fighting for the truth and still get nothing but sealed files and legal immunity. Tonight, we go inside the walls that hide secrets. And what you are about to learn will change how you see the American justice system forever. Let me take you to the Mississippi Delta. Flat farmlands stretching to the horizon. Cotton fields that once held enslaved workers now surround a different kind of forced labor. Mississippi State Penitentiary. Most people call it Parchman Farm. It opened in 1901 on 18,000 acres of former plantation land. From its very first day, it was designed not for rehabilitation but for punishment and profit. Inmates worked the fields under armed guards on horseback. They picked cotton. They harvested crops. They built the very buildings that would cage future generations. The echoes of slavery never left this land. They just changed form. For decades, Parchman operated with minimal oversight. It was remote. It was self-sustaining. It was forgotten by everyone except the men trapped inside and the families who prayed for their return. Wardens ruled like kings over their own private kingdom. Guards enforced order through fear. And the outside world did not care enough to look closely at what happened behind those gates. Then came January 2020. In a single month, 9 inmates died at Parchman. 9 human beings whose lives ended inside those walls. The official explanations varied. Gang violence. Natural causes, suicide. But the families were not buying it. The advocates were not buying it. And when journalists finally gained access to the facility, what they found was a horror that defied imagination. Cells flooded with raw sewage. Rats the size of small cats roaming freely through housing units. Black mold climbing the walls. Broken windows letting in the Mississippi winter. No heat. No running water in some units. Inmates drinking from toilets because the sinks had been broken for years. Men with serious mental illness locked in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day with no treatment, no medication, no human contact except for food trays slid through slots in the door. The understaffing was catastrophic. Entire housing units went unsupervised for hours at a time. Guards were so scarce that inmates essentially governed themselves, and in that power vacuum, the strongest and most violent seized control. Gangs ran cell blocks. Debts were settled with blood. And anyone who did not have protection was prey. But here's what makes this story so much darker than simple neglect. When families demanded investigations, doors closed. When lawyers filed lawsuits, they were met with sealed records and claims of security concerns. When journalists submitted Freedom of Information requests, they received pages of blacked-out text. The system that was supposed to provide transparency instead built walls of bureaucracy as thick as the concrete surrounding Parchman. One case haunts investigators to this day. A young man serving time for a nonviolent drug offense. His family received a call saying he had been found unresponsive in his cell. Natural causes, they were told. Heart failure. He was 26 years old with no history of heart problems. When his mother demanded an independent autopsy, she discovered bruises covering his torso, defensive wounds on his arms, and trauma to his head consistent with being struck by a blunt object. She took this evidence to authorities. The case was reviewed internally and closed within weeks. No charges filed. No officers disciplined. No answers provided. This pattern repeats across the country. In Alabama, Holman Correctional Facility has been called the most dangerous prison in America. Stabbings occur so frequently that guards have reportedly stopped responding to all but the most severe incidents. Inmates have described a war zone where survival depends on joining a gang or finding a corner to hide and pray. The Department of Justice investigated and found conditions so brutal they likely violated the Constitution. Yet years later, many of the same conditions persist. In New York, Rikers Island has become synonymous with abuse and death. The jail complex, which holds primarily pretrial detainees who have not even been convicted of crimes, has seen suicide rates far above the national average. Inmates have died from lack of medical care, from violence that guards allegedly witnessed and ignored, from heat stroke when temperatures inside cells exceeded 100 degrees. One man with mental illness was held in solitary confinement and essentially baked to death because the heating system malfunctioned, and nobody checked on him for hours. His body temperature at death was 108 degrees. These are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a system that has been allowed to operate in darkness for far too long. When you send someone to prison in America, you are trusting that the government will keep them alive until their sentence is complete. You are trusting that punishment means loss of freedom, not loss of life. But for too many families, a prison sentence becomes a death sentence that nobody voted for and nobody approved. Why does this keep happening? The answers are complicated but not mysterious. Prisons are built far from population centers, out of sight and out of mind. The people inside them have been convicted of crimes, so society often views them as undeserving of sympathy or protection. Politicians win elections by being tough on crime, not by advocating for humane prison conditions. Guards unions protect their members from accountability. Private prison companies lobby for laws that increase incarceration while cutting costs that might improve safety. And underneath it all is a fundamental truth that America has never fully confronted. We built a system designed to cage millions of people, disproportionately poor and disproportionately black and brown, and we never invested in making that system anything other than a warehouse for human beings we would rather forget. The prisons filled up. The budget stayed flat. The oversight remained minimal. And in that gap between what we claim to believe and what we actually fund, people started dying. But the deaths are only part of the story. What happens to the investigations afterward reveals something even more disturbing about how power operates in America. Evidence disappears. Witnesses are transferred to facilities across the country. Guards close ranks. Prosecutors decline to file charges against corrections officers. Lawsuits are settled quietly with no admission of wrongdoing and sealed agreements that prevent families from speaking publicly about what happened. The families who fight for answers often describe the same experience. Initial shock and grief give way to determination. They hire lawyers. They file requests. They make phone calls. And slowly, they realize they are not fighting against bureaucratic inefficiency. They are fighting against a machine specifically designed to protect itself by burying the truth. One mother spent 7 years trying to get the full investigative file on her son's death. When she finally received it through a court order, half the pages were redacted. Witness statements were blacked out. Photographs were withheld for security reasons. She learned more about how her son died from other inmates who wrote her letters than from any official source. This is not justice. This is not accountability. This is a system eating its own evidence and calling it policy. And if you think this only happens in the worst facilities, in the most backward states, think again. In the next chapter, we will go inside the prisons that look clean on the surface but hide the same rot underneath. The private facilities where profit motives override human lives. The federal institutions that are supposed to set the standard but instead set new lows. And we will meet the whistleblowers who risked everything to tell the truth about what they witnessed behind the walls. The nightmare is not contained in one prison or one state. It is woven into the fabric of American incarceration. And until we are willing to look directly at what we have built, nothing will change. That investigation continues right here on this channel. This is only the surface of what the walls are hiding. The doors of a private prison look exactly like the doors of a state-run facility. The razor wire gleams the same way in the morning sun. The guards wear similar uniforms. The inmates wear the same jumpsuits. But behind those identical walls, something fundamentally different is happening. Every meal served, every bed filled, every day a human being spends in a cell generates profit for shareholders who will never set foot inside. And when profit becomes the primary motive, human lives become line items on a spreadsheet. Expendable. Reducible. Forgettable. Welcome to the second layer of this nightmare. The private prison industry. A multi-billion-dollar enterprise built on a simple premise: the more people locked up, the more money made. The longer they stay, the better the quarterly earnings. And if a few of them die along the way, well, that is just the cost of doing business. The rise of private prisons in America began in the 1980s during the explosion of mass incarceration. State budgets could not keep up with the flood of inmates created by mandatory minimum sentences and the war on drugs. Private companies offered a solution. Let us build the prisons. Let us run them. We will do it cheaper than you can. Politicians saw a way to appear tough on crime without raising taxes. The contracts were signed. The money started flowing. Today, private prison companies like Kalief and Geo Group operate facilities across the country housing over 100,000 inmates. They are publicly traded corporations with fiduciary duties to maximize shareholder value. Their executives earn millions. Their lobbyists spend millions more ensuring that laws continue to funnel human beings into their facilities. They have contributed to campaigns of politicians who then vote for harsher sentencing. They have fought against criminal justice reform. They have built an empire on human suffering. But the cost-cutting that makes these companies profitable is exactly what makes them deadly. Consider what happens when you need to reduce expenses inside a prison. Staff salaries are the biggest cost. So you hire fewer guards. You pay them less. You train them minimally. You create a workforce that is overworked, underpaid, and undertrained to handle the most volatile population in America. Then you wonder why violence spirals out of control. In 2012, a riot at a private prison in Mississippi left one guard dead and dozens injured. Investigators found that the facility was operating with a skeleton crew. Guards were responsible for far more inmates than safety standards recommended. Warning signs had been ignored for months. Tensions had been building. And when the explosion finally came, there were simply not enough staff to contain it. Medical care is another easy target for budget cuts. Private prisons often contract with the lowest bidder for healthcare services. These medical providers have their own profit motives. Every test not ordered is money saved. Every specialist referral avoided is a cost eliminated. Every complaint dismissed as malingering is expense that never hits the books. The results are predictable and horrific. Inmates with cancer go undiagnosed until the disease is terminal. Diabetics are denied insulin until they slip into comas. People with mental illness receive no treatment and deteriorate until they become unmanageable, at which point they are thrown into solitary confinement instead of hospitals. The sick become sicker. The treatable become untreatable. The living become the dead. One case that made national headlines involved a woman at a private facility in Florida. She was pregnant when she entered the prison on a minor charge. Over the course of her pregnancy, she complained repeatedly of pain and complications. Medical staff allegedly dismissed her concerns. She went into labor in her cell with no medical professional present. The baby died. Investigations followed. Lawsuits were filed. The company paid a settlement. And the facility remained open, still accepting inmates, still collecting per diem payments from the state. The contracts between states and private prison companies often contain clauses that guarantee occupancy rates. If the state does not provide enough inmates to fill a certain percentage of beds, the state must pay anyway. This creates a perverse incentive. The government has a financial motivation to keep prisons full. Judges may feel subtle pressure to impose longer sentences. Parole boards may be less generous with early releases. The entire system bends toward incarceration because the contracts demand bodies. Think about what this means. The private prison industry has essentially created a market for prisoners. They need inventory. They need human beings to fill their facilities and justify their existence to shareholders. They spend money to influence the laws that create criminals. They lobby against the reforms that would reduce prison populations. They have turned mass incarceration from a policy failure into a business model. But private prisons are only one part of this story. The federal system, which should set the standard for corrections nationwide, has its own catalog of horrors. The United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. The Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, where Jeffrey Epstein died under circumstances that sparked conspiracy theories worldwide. The federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, where executions resumed after a 17-year pause. These facilities operate under direct federal oversight, with resources and standards that should exceed state systems. Yet the same patterns of violence, neglect, and suspicious deaths appear. In 2022, the Associated Press published an investigation revealing that more than 100 federal inmates had died over an 18-month period from causes that warranted deeper scrutiny. Suicides in facilities with supposedly enhanced monitoring. Homicides in housing units that should have been supervised. Medical deaths from conditions that should have been treatable. The Bureau of Prisons, which operates these facilities, repeatedly declined to answer detailed questions. The most notorious federal facility is perhaps ADX Florence, the supermax prison in Colorado that holds the most dangerous inmates in the country. Terrorists, cartel leaders, serial killers. Inmates are confined to their cells for 22 to 24 hours a day. Human contact is virtually eliminated. The design is intended to completely neutralize any threat an inmate might pose. But mental health experts have repeatedly warned that the extreme isolation of supermax confinement constitutes psychological torture. Inmates have described losing their grip on reality. Hallucinations become common. Self-harm becomes a way to feel something in the sensory void. Some inmates have been released directly from supermax to the streets after years of isolation, with no transition and no support. We create human beings who are psychologically destroyed and then release them into society. The guards who work in these facilities are not immune to the damage. Corrections officers have some of the highest rates of PTSD, depression, and suicide of any profession. They witness violence daily. They are assaulted, threatened, and dehumanized. Many become desensitized to suffering as a survival mechanism. Others struggle with what they have seen and done. The system breaks everyone it touches, inmate and officer alike. And then there are the whistleblowers. The guards and administrators and medical staff who decided that silence was no longer an option. Their stories reveal both the depth of the problems and the consequences of speaking out. One corrections officer in Florida went public about conditions at his facility. He described inmates being denied food as punishment. He described guards using excessive force and falsifying reports. He described a culture of impunity where the worst officers were protected and anyone who complained was targeted. After he spoke to journalists, he was transferred to a less desirable posting. He faced harassment from colleagues. His career effectively ended. A nurse at a private facility in Arizona reported that inmates were dying from medical neglect. She documented case after case where treatable conditions became fatal because of cost-cutting and indifference. When she escalated her concerns internally, she was told to stop making waves. When she went to state regulators, the company launched an investigation into her performance. She was eventually terminated for alleged policy violations. She sued. The case was settled. A confidentiality agreement ensures she can never speak publicly about the details. A warden at a state prison wrote a letter to the governor describing conditions that he believed violated basic human rights. He detailed the understaffing, the violence, the inadequate mental health treatment. The letter was leaked to the press. Within months, he was reassigned to a desk job. His pension was threatened. Other wardens learned the lesson. Speaking out means losing everything. The system has built an immune response to accountability. It identifies threats to its secrets and neutralizes them. Whistleblowers are isolated, discredited, and destroyed. And those who remain learn that the safest path is silence. This is why the truth so rarely emerges. The people who know what is really happening inside these facilities have every incentive to stay quiet and every reason to fear the consequences of speaking. The few who summon the courage to talk face retaliation that follows them for the rest of their careers. And the public remains ignorant because ignorance is comfortable and the truth is unbearable. But occasionally, the walls crack. Lawsuits produce discovery documents that reveal internal communications. Journalists obtain leaked reports. Families persist until they find an ally inside the system, and piece by piece, a picture emerges of something that should have been unthinkable in a nation that claims to believe in justice. In Alabama, a federal investigation produced a report that read like a horror novel. Investigators found that violence in Alabama prisons was so severe that it likely violated the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. They documented rape, assault, and murder occurring at rates far exceeding national averages. They described prisons where inmates were afraid to sleep, where certain areas were controlled by gangs and guards simply did not enter, where vulnerable inmates were targeted and officials looked the other way. The report recommended sweeping changes. That was in 2019. Years later, many of the same conditions persist. The lawsuit continues. The inmates continue to suffer. And the state continues to argue that it is doing enough while bodies continue to appear. The federal government has the power to take over state prison systems that violate constitutional standards. It has done so in the past. But such interventions are rare, expensive, and politically complicated. States resist. Local officials claim federal overreach. And the political will to force change rarely survives the initial outrage. So the system continues. Private companies continue to profit. Public facilities continue to deteriorate. Inmates continue to die. And families continue to receive phone calls that destroy their worlds, followed by investigations that provide no answers and accountability that never arrives. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this story is not what happens inside the prisons. It is what happens after. The inmates who survive these conditions are eventually released. Over 95% of incarcerated people will return to society at some point. They will be your neighbors. They will work at your local businesses. They will walk the same streets as your children. What have we created inside them? People who have experienced years of trauma, violence, and dehumanization. People who have learned that power comes from brutality and survival requires abandoning mercy. People who have been denied mental health treatment, education, and any preparation for life outside. We have built factories for damaged human beings, and then we express shock when they struggle to reintegrate into communities. The recidivism rate tells the story. Within 3 years of release, about 2/3 of former prisoners are rearrested. Within 5 years, over 3/4. We spend billions to incarcerate people in conditions that make them worse. Then we release them with minimal support and wonder why they end up back behind bars. The cycle feeds itself. The prisons stay full. The private companies stay profitable. And society stays convinced that the problem is the people, not the system. Breaking this cycle would require something America has never truly attempted. It would require acknowledging that our approach to incarceration is fundamentally broken. That we have prioritized punishment over rehabilitation to a degree that is self-defeating. That we have allowed conditions to develop behind prison walls that would spark international condemnation if they occurred anywhere else. It would require investing in mental health treatment, in education, in job training, and substance abuse programs. It would require reducing the prison population through sentencing reform and alternatives to incarceration. It would require treating corrections officers as professionals who need support and training, not as expendable bodies we throw at an impossible situation. It would require transparency, oversight, and accountability at every level. In other words, it would require political courage that has been absent for decades. In the next chapter, we will examine the cases that have forced brief moments of reckoning, the deaths so outrageous that they pierce the public consciousness, the investigations that produced real consequences, the reforms that worked in some places and the resistance that blocked them in others. And we will ask the hardest question of all: is change possible, or are we simply managing a system that is too profitable and too politically convenient to ever truly fix? The stories waiting in the final chapter are both devastating and occasionally hopeful. They reveal what happens when sunlight finally reaches the darkest corners of our justice system, and they offer a choice that each of us must make about what kind of society we want to live in. That choice, and those stories, continue right here on this channel. The walls are starting to crack. What spills out will change how you see everything. Sometimes the walls crack wide enough that the whole world sees what is inside. Sometimes a death is so egregious, so undeniably wrong, that even the most protected systems cannot contain the fallout. Sometimes a name breaks through the noise and forces a nation to confront what it has allowed to happen in its name. These are the cases that changed laws. The deaths that sparked movements. The moments when the machine briefly stopped and accountability seemed possible. But as we will see, even the most powerful reckonings can fade. And the system has a remarkable ability to absorb outrage, make cosmetic changes, and continue operating exactly as it did before. Let me tell you about Kalief Browder. In 2010, a 16-year-old boy from the Bronx was arrested for allegedly stealing a backpack. He maintained his innocence from the first moment. His family could not afford the $3,000 bail. So Kalief Browder was sent to Rikers Island to await trial. He would spend the next 3 years there. 3 years without being convicted of anything. 3 years in one of the most violent jails in America. And what happened to him during those 3 years would eventually kill him, even after he was finally released. Kalief spent nearly 2 years in solitary confinement. He was beaten by guards and inmates. He was denied adequate food. He attempted suicide multiple times. Security footage that was later released showed him being attacked while his hands were cuffed behind his back. It showed guards slamming him to the ground. It showed the daily brutality of a system that had already decided he was guilty, even though no court ever would. In 2013, the charges against Kalief Browder were dismissed. The case simply fell apart. There was no trial, no conviction, no justice. Just 3 years stolen from a teenager who had done nothing wrong. He walked out of Rikers Island a different person than the boy who had walked in. The trauma had rewired his brain. The isolation had broken something fundamental inside him. He struggled to reconnect with family and friends. He could not escape the memories. In 2015, Kalief Browder hanged himself in his childhood home. He was 22 years old. His death sparked national outrage. Celebrities spoke his name. Politicians made promises. New York City announced reforms to Rikers Island, including ending solitary confinement for inmates under 21. The bail system that had trapped Kalief became a target for reform movements across the country. For a moment, it seemed like his suffering might mean something. Like his death might save others. But nearly a decade later, Rikers Island remains open. Violence continues. Deaths continue. The facility was supposed to close by 2027, but that deadline has been pushed back. The reforms that were promised have been implemented partially, inconsistently, or not at all. The guards union has fought changes. The city has blamed budget constraints. And new names have joined Kalief Browder on the list of people who died waiting for a system to protect them. This is the pattern. Outrage followed by promises followed by slow forgetting. The machine absorbs the criticism, makes adjustments at the margins, and continues grinding forward. Sandra Bland was another name that pierced the public consciousness. In 2015, she was pulled over in Texas for failing to signal a lane change, a minor traffic violation that should have resulted in a warning or a ticket. Instead, the traffic stop escalated. The officer became aggressive. Sandra Bland was arrested and taken to jail. 3 days later, she was found dead in her cell. Officials ruled it suicide by hanging. Her family did not believe it. Activists did not believe it. The video of her arrest, showing an officer threatening her with a taser and dragging her from her car, contradicted any narrative of a routine stop. Questions swirled. Investigations were launched. The officer was eventually fired and charged with perjury, though the case was later dismissed. The jail was found to have violated standards regarding inmate observation and training. A settlement was reached. Reforms were promised. But Sandra Bland is still dead. And traffic stops continue to escalate into violence. And people continue to die in jails within days of arrest under circumstances that their families will never fully understand. The name that perhaps generated the most conspiracy theories was Jeffrey Epstein. In 2019, the wealthy financier and convicted sex offender was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. He was awaiting trial on federal sex trafficking charges that implicated some of the most powerful people in the world. His death was ruled a suicide. But the circumstances were so suspicious that they strained belief. 2 guards assigned to check on him had allegedly fallen asleep and falsified records. 2 security cameras outside his cell had malfunctioned. He had been taken off suicide watch despite a previous attempt. His cellmate had been transferred, leaving him alone. Every safeguard that should have prevented his death had failed simultaneously. Whether you believe Epstein killed himself or was killed to protect powerful people, the case exposed the dysfunction of the federal prison system in ways that could not be ignored. Congressional hearings were held. The warden was reassigned. The guards were charged with falsifying records, though the charges were later dropped after they agreed to community service. The Metropolitan Correctional Center was eventually closed in 2021, with officials citing infrastructure issues rather than the failures that led to Epstein's death. But the closure of one facility does not fix a broken system. It merely relocates the problems. The inmates who were held at MCC were transferred to other facilities with their own histories of neglect and abuse. The guards who worked there found jobs at other prisons. The culture that enabled the dysfunction continued elsewhere, wearing different uniforms in different buildings. These high-profile cases create the illusion of accountability. Investigations are announced. Reports are published. Officials express concern. Sometimes people are fired or charged. Sometimes facilities are closed. Sometimes laws are changed. And then the news cycle moves on. The public's attention shifts. And the system quietly returns to its default settings. The question we must ask is whether meaningful reform is even possible within the current structure. And the honest answer is deeply uncertain. There are places where change has happened, where conditions have genuinely improved, where violence has decreased and rehabilitation has become more than a slogan. These success stories are important because they prove that the current horror is not inevitable. Different choices can produce different outcomes. Norway's prison system is often cited as a model. Their facilities look more like college campuses than concrete fortresses. Inmates live in private rooms with windows and furniture. They have access to education, job training, therapy, and recreational activities. Guards are trained extensively in conflict resolution and building relationships with inmates. The maximum sentence for any crime, including murder, is 21 years. And Norway's recidivism rate is around 20%, compared to over 70% in the United States. Critics argue that Norway is smaller, more homogeneous, and culturally different from America. They say what works there cannot work here. But American facilities have adopted Norwegian principles and seen results. A prison in North Dakota partnered with Norwegian corrections officials and transformed its approach. Violence decreased. Staff morale improved. Inmates were better prepared for release. The model works when there is political will to implement it. Germany has also taken a different approach, emphasizing rehabilitation and limiting the use of solitary confinement. German prisons allow inmates to wear their own clothes, cook their own meals, and maintain relationships with family through regular visits. The focus is on preparing people for successful reintegration into society, not simply punishing them until their sentence ends. Even within the United States, some states have made meaningful progress. New York eliminated solitary confinement for inmates under 21 and limited it for others. Colorado reformed its use of isolation after a former director spent time in a solitary cell to understand the experience firsthand. Connecticut closed its Supermax facility entirely. These changes happened because activists, journalists, and lawmakers refused to accept that the status quo was acceptable. But for every step forward, there are forces pushing back. Guards unions resist changes that might reduce their control or require new training. Politicians fear being labeled soft on crime. Private prison companies lobby against reforms that would reduce their population and profits. And a significant portion of the public simply does not care what happens to people who have been convicted of crimes. They see suffering as deserved punishment, not as a policy failure that makes everyone less safe. The resistance is strongest when reform requires resources. It is relatively easy to pass a law limiting solitary confinement. It is much harder to fund additional staff, mental health professionals, and programming that would replace isolation with something productive. Meaningful reform costs money. And in the competition for public funds, prisoners consistently rank last. So where does this leave us? What can possibly change a system this entrenched, this profitable, this politically protected? The answer, frustrating as it may be, is pressure. Sustained, relentless pressure from multiple directions. Families who refuse to accept official explanations for their loved ones' deaths. Lawyers who file lawsuit after lawsuit until the cost of abuse exceeds the savings from neglect. Journalists who obtain footage and documents that contradict official narratives. Activists who organize and march and vote. Voters who demand that their representatives prioritize criminal justice reform. Change is possible. History proves it. The horrors of past eras, from chain gangs to convict leasing to routine torture, have been reduced through advocacy and legislation. The system has been forced to evolve before. It can be forced to evolve again. But it will not happen automatically. It will not happen because officials suddenly develop consciences. It will not happen because the cruelty becomes too obvious to ignore. The system has proven that it can ignore extraordinary cruelty indefinitely if nobody forces it to look. The walls hide what we allow them to hide. The deaths continue at the pace we tolerate. The reforms happen when we make them politically necessary and not a moment before. This is the uncomfortable truth that this documentary has been building toward. The prisons are not broken. They are functioning exactly as designed. They warehouse human beings at the lowest possible cost with the least possible oversight. They generate profits for private companies and political capital for tough-on-crime politicians. They remove from society people who are inconvenient, troublesome, or simply too poor to afford better outcomes. And they do all of this behind walls thick enough that the screams do not reach the suburbs. We built this system. We fund it with our taxes. We elect the officials who oversee it. We watch the news stories, feel briefly outraged, and then change the channel. We are complicit in every death, every beating, every mind destroyed by isolation, every family that never gets answers. Not because we ordered these things, but because we have not demanded they stop. The question is not whether the system can change. The question is whether we want it to. Whether we are willing to see incarcerated people as human beings deserving of basic dignity. Whether we can accept that punishment should not mean torture. Whether we believe that a society should be judged by how it treats its most despised members. These are not questions about policy. They are questions about who we are. The inmates who have died in the facilities we examined throughout this documentary were someone's children. They had names and histories and people who loved them. Some committed terrible crimes. Some committed minor offenses. Some were awaiting trial and had not been convicted of anything. But all of them were entitled to survive their sentences. All of them were entitled to safety. All of them were failed by a system that promised justice and delivered something much darker. Michael, Sandra, Kalief, Jeffrey, and thousands of others whose names never made headlines, whose deaths were recorded as suicides or natural causes or unexplained incidents, whose families are still waiting for phone calls that will never come and answers that will never arrive. They deserve better. We can do better. But only if we choose to. The walls are high. The secrets are deep. The forces protecting the status quo are powerful. But they are not invincible. Every system built by humans can be changed by humans. Every injustice that persists does so only because not enough people have demanded otherwise. This documentary has shown you what is behind the walls. Now the question is what you will do with that knowledge. Will you share it? Will you demand accountability from your elected officials? Will you support organizations fighting for prison reform? Will you remember these names and refuse to let them become statistics? The choice is yours. The walls will keep hiding their secrets until enough of us decide that the hiding must end. If you have made it this far, you understand what this channel is about. We do not look away from difficult truths. We do not accept official explanations without question. We investigate. We expose. We remember the forgotten. There are more stories waiting. More walls to examine. More secrets to uncover. More names that deserve to be spoken. Subscribe, share, comment, return. Because the nightmare does not end when the video stops. The prisons are still there. The inmates are still suffering. The families are still waiting, and the reckoning is far from over.